All right, welcome back, everybody. We're going to do another book review with my great friend and the great scholar, David Martin Jones. David, welcome.
Thank you very much for that brilliant introduction.
Always good to see you. And this is the only way we're seeing each other in lockdown. We're still in a partial lockdown. So, you know, maybe we've got some sunshine. Maybe next time we do a book review, we can do it outside in the sun and have a much less stilted conversation. I still feel this is stilted, although we're getting used to it. Anyway, this is the book we're looking at. This is called American Awakening by Joshua Mitchell. It's another book out of Encounter Books. The press is Encounter Books. American Awakening. It was actually published towards the end of 2020, and we're just getting around to to reviewing it now. I think, David, it's always a good idea, I think, for us each to give a very brief first impression or synopsis of it. So I'll go first just for efficiency. I think this is a very philosophical book. It's very insightful. I should say straight away that the title could be a little misleading. It could suggest that this is about American politics, and it's really not. It's about a Western awakening. It applies as much to Britain or anywhere else in the West, that we have what Joshua Mitchell calls afflictions that are bringing down our politics and society. So afflictions such as identity politics and addictions. So I've just gone from afflictions to addictions, addictions to things like social media. Brings a lot of things together in a very philosophical way. So that's why I'm excited to talk to you about this, David, because you're much more philosophical than I. That was my brief synopsis. What do you think?
Yeah, I do think although you're quite right, it is a similar affliction that applies to the West generally. I think his focus on American, the American kind of difficulty with identity politics has a specific American etiology, if you like, particularly as he emphasizes the stain of slavery in the American context, which doesn't seem to have quite the same resonance in Europe, actually. It has the resonance, obviously, in the UK, where the links between American woke culture and the UK adaptation of it is very strong. But in France or Italy or Spain, which have equally, difficult colonial histories, I don't get the impression it's so woke there. I think there's a bit more integrity, if you like, to French culture in a way that American and British culture have degenerated into a self-loathing that Mitchell identifies brilliantly, I think. So
I think from an American perspective, I think he overstates the slavery as a current issue, in the sense that he treats slavery as an original sin. So I'm quoting, he has a very Christian philosophical take on our current afflictions, and he describes slavery as America's original sin, which other people they've used that phrase too, but I think his mistake is he treats it as he acquiesces in the woke's treatment of slavery as an original sin that Americans must carry now, which is surprises me, because he self-identifies as a liberal, and as you know, as a liberal, we cannot punish the sons for the sins of the fathers. So slavery may be America's original sin. It may be the sin of a previous generation, but it's not the sin of my generation. We should not be held accountable, let alone be told to feel constantly guilty for the sins of our fathers. That's the liberal position. Now, Joshua Mitchell identifies as liberal, but does not make that point, which surprises me. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, the interesting take on religion that permeates Mitchell's account is how this sort of original sin has gone from, has been so so used in American politics that it's assumed a religious character, but it's not properly religious. It's a religious understanding without the possibility of redemption. So I think whether or not he should be saying, as you say, that, I'm not responsible for the sins of my fathers, nevertheless, that understanding that slavery is the original sin has sort of carried on in a cultural, in a political cultural context to become all pervasive in the woke left understanding, really, to the extent that I think the key distinction that he's making, that the religious aspect or the quasi-religious aspect of the original sin has become politicized in a religious way, so that then the identity politics that has flourished, particularly since the end of the Cold War, which is the conditions of its emergence, really, enables this sort of Manichaean division to be made between the transgressor and the innocent. And from that, all our wokeness kind of emerges or is explained. And he explains it, I think, very well, that white heterosexual males are the original sinners. Those who are not exposed to that original sin are therefore innocent and pure. And minorities now are the bearers of purity and innocence in a way that gives them absolute right, it seems, to pursue and basically punish the transgressing white male whose only role is to be quiet, to submit to the condign punishment that is meted out, or by, as we know with the woke white, over-identifying with the politics to say that, we absolutely deeply embrace this and must make it the conditions of our institutions. At the same time, never actually sort of, as a white senior executive or dean of a university, ever resigning because of their whiteness, because they have somehow now admitted their primary guilt in order to become part of the innocent by default, or by identification, really. Sorry.
Yeah. So as you indicated earlier, Mitchell he's criticizing how the woke divides human beings into two possible populations. You're either innocent or you're a transgressor, and you are a transgressor by identity politics, demographic identity politics. But if you're white heterosexual male, that's the 3-word subpopulation that Mitchell identifies as the original sinners. So you're part of that. You're going to be identified as a sinner unless you do all this virtue signaling to communicate that you are mindful of your original sin and you're overcompensating for it. He advances an argument that I've not seen before. We actually, you and I saw a little of it in that book, Who Rules, edited by Kimball. There's some of the chapter authors in that edited volume also advance the idea that wokeness is a new religion that is replacing the decline of Christianity in America with the same religious zeal. They just don't have a God to moderate themselves. And Mitchell is saying something quite similar. You should give me your understanding of what he's saying here. He's saying that the decline of the Christian church in America, particularly the Protestant church, has left American culture with the same Christian understanding of sinning and innocence, but has abandoned the Christian allowance for the sinner to be forgiven. So this is a key difference. You tell me how you understood this. That Christianity allows the sinner to be forgiven. The woke do not allow the sinner to be forgiven. They only allow the sinner, white heterosexual males, to announce their virtue, signal their virtue. He actually calls it innocence signaling, which is interesting. Constantly signal that, yes, we are aware that we're of the sinning group, but by our awareness and our acquiescence in your ideology, we are protecting ourselves from further persecution. So this is the thing which I found very unique to Mitchell's work, that we're living in the same Christian reductionism, innocence versus transgression, and yet there is no room for forgiveness. Is that correct understanding?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that's a very strong point or strong argument that Mitchell makes, that the in the Christian understanding, particularly in the Protestant churches, but Catholicism too, that Christ sacrificed himself for our sins, and therefore the innocence of the Lamb of God has the potential to redeem us all as believers who can achieve salvation. So in the Christian message, our sins can be forgiven. In the reinterpretation of religion without religion, through the the salvificatory or the soteriological character of the new woke politics, it's the damned, which is still part of a Calvinist kind of eschatology, are forever damned and unable to achieve salvation. In a sense, as he points out, the Calvinists were always stronger on the idea of irredeemable sinfulness and the saved nature of the Protestant saints, going back to 16th and 17th century millenarianism, which interestingly Mitchell doesn't refer to, which I find kind of odd, because the other aspect of this that I suppose have made a point of in my book History's Fools, is that there's this kind of a Gnosticism here that is being practiced, that writers like Eric Voegelin referred to in terms of the emergence of what he calls political religion in the 1930s, of which woke has a very strong resemblance to. And the kind of Gnosticism that Voegelin refers to, which is about taking the idea of salvation, which is to be properly understood as a Christian, to be achieved in the next world, can be achieved in this world. And for Voegelin, this desire to have salvation upon earth is the basis of a number of this worldly utopias that end as failed dystopias, whether it's the revolution of the saints in the 1650s in England, the various millenarian groups like the Ranters and the Fifth Monarchists, or when it comes later to an ideological rereading of this worldly Gnosticism in both totalitarian movements of the 20th century, like Stalinism or fascism. So, I mean, I think he's quite right that the religious imperative that underpins the woke agenda does not allow redemption. But in a sense, this is also prefigured in other Gnostic accounts that Mitchell, I found quite surprisingly, didn't refer to.
Yeah, I suppose the explanation for that is that he is much more interested in drawing on, well, two sources. One is the Bible, and the other is Alexander de Tocqueville, of whom he has written a lot of previous work. So he's anchored in his previous work on the Bible and Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So he tends to draw on those two sources in a very parochial, personal sense. Let's call it a personal sense. He draws very personally on those two sources, which has the disadvantage, as you are articulating, of ignoring wider philosophical and historical background to what we're living through now. There's something else I wanted to bring in, which we haven't mentioned yet, which I think is what his other source is the Hebrew Bible. So he self-identifies as a Protestant several times in this book, and he does that in the book in order to well, for two reasons. He wants to make light of his identity, and he wants to reflect on the ridiculousness of identity politics, that he as an immigrant, as a descendant of immigrants, he could identify with all sorts of identities, but he identifies as Protestant. But he also uses the Hebrew Bible, and he gets from Judaism the concept of the scapegoat, which is not particularly Christian. There is scapegoating in Christianity, but we identify scapegoating as from more of the Judeo part of the Judeo-Christian culture. And so this is relevant to the problem you were talking about earlier of how there is no redemption in woke politics. One reason, as we discussed, is that if the transgressors, the guilty, are identified by their genetic markers, their highly observable genetic markers like race, skin color, gender, sex, gender, then there's no redemption. So if you're guilty by being white, you can't change that. You can virtue signal, you can sort of try to shield yourself from too much persecution by acquiescing in the madness of the crowd, but you can't change your whiteness. So you're still guilty to some extent. So there's no forgiveness there. But then this is the scapegoating part. If as Mitchell articulates it, the woke treat the transgressor identities, mostly white heterosexual males, treats them as scapegoats, meaning that the woke need the scapegoats in order to self-identify. They need to identify themselves as against a scapegoat, and their activism is motivated to purge society of scapegoats, get rid of white heterosexual males, the patriarchy, the white justice system, and all these other nonsensical conflations of identity politics with our institutions. That scapegoating comes more from Judaism than from Christianity in Mitchell's account. And again, I think this is quite profound in Mitchell's argument that other people have said that wokeism looks like a religion because it's so messianic. And it's blind to reason and facts. And it becomes an ideology that you're either with us or against us. So other people have pointed out it has the characteristics of a religion, but I think Mitchell is the best I've read so far at articulating it doesn't just look like a religion, it has all the worst aspects of a religion while pretending to be non-religious.
Yes.
Is that fair?
I think that's very fair. Yeah, I think you summed that up very nicely. And the idea of the scapegoat that he explores in tremendous, you know, kind of richness, really. He uses that quite sort of, well, very effectively to show exactly how that scapegoating without redemption operates. And the further point that leads from that, as he shows, is that actually, you know, the white heterosexual male as the scapegoat who's irredeemable, even those who now, you know, try to speak for the innocent who are white, are merely, you know, kind of temporarily on the side of the innocent, because ultimately the innocent who are not white will take over in their various purified group identities. But as he says, you know, exterminating the white male will call for a new scapegoat, maybe the black male, or more likely the white female who still holds on to her, you know, sexual identity, as against the fact that all such identities are constructed, and anybody who wants to be female and identifies as such can be so. So we see at the moment the playing out of issues, notably, you know, particularly in the UK, where feminist academics who maintain that having female sexual organs is definitive. So it ends up with people like Germaine Greer, a radical feminist in her day, getting no platform at a university down the road from where I'm speaking in Cardiff. So ultimately, you know, that the scapegoating will move on, and it's already identified feminists who hold the idea of a sexual identity as basically fundamental under attack. Black males who are heterosexual could easily see themselves as a potential target. So where will it all end is you know, Mitchell's interesting question, and in a sense it becomes, well, you know, it's not uninteresting that he links this also to the purification of the planet movement, which a lot of young white heterosexual males who will have to redefine themselves obviously identify with through arrangements or through groups or organizations like Extinction Rebellion, and the kind of transhumanist program that begins to emerge would seem to want to eradicate, as Mitchell says, not only all humans, but all mammals from the planet, to restore it to its Gaia virtue, presumably.
Yeah, that's you raised that and it made me laugh. There's quite a few funny moments in this book where he has a knack. Joshua Mitchell has a knack for raising very funny illustrative examples in a black comic sense, meaning in a dark comic sense.
Be careful with your words.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, what we used to call black comedy. It's darkly humorous. Like the other section that really made me laugh was when he was talking about virtue signaling in academia, and he got there from his theory where he's talking about the transgressors, so the identity politic categorized transgressors, white heterosexual males. They're constantly signaling their virtues on the doors of their offices.
Yes,
So
yes,
it's a really funny account.
yes.
He writes a paragraph where he says, you know, you walk around any university and you walk past the doors and there's all these that people are pasting cuttings from newspapers about how ridiculous Trump is, or how awful men are, and how slavery is still a 18th century slavery is still a pertinent issue for the whole of the West. And it comes from his theory that people are trying to protect themselves from being scapegoated. They're just constantly using these signals as shields from persecution. So I just wanted to make the point. It can be darkly funny, but bittersweet. The humor in it is bittersweet. It's you know, it can be a depressing read at times, particularly when he starts talking about addictions. It's at that point of the book that I thought, oh, there's not much help. You can hope for swings. What he swings, and I was going to say swings and roundabouts in politics. He calls them oscillations. That's a really interesting theory too. You can hope that identity politics fails because eventually politics swings away from its excesses and it overcompensates the other way. That's the oscillation. But the addictions to new technologies, these are new technologies like social media. You and I have spoken about them. You've written a lot about them in History's Fools. That things like social media change our situation. They reduce the autonomy of the individual and therefore undermine liberalism. So if the individual doesn't feel that they have the power to run their own lives, they have to run their lives through social media and get social approval through social media. They're no longer autonomous. And Mitchell articulates that too, that people are losing what he calls the liberalism of competence. Yes. That individuals no longer feel they have the competence to run their own lives. They need the state, or they need approval or help through social media. And it's undermining the competence of the individual. And without the competence of the individual, you can't really run liberal politics, because liberal politics is about the freedom of the individual. So without competence of the individual, there's no point having freedom of the individual, because the individual needs the state or needs society to do things for the individual. And that's where I thought the book was most alarming, because social media is with us, it's not going away. And there are other things that are not going away. So the welfare state, the increasingly interventionist welfare state, is going to be very difficult to dismantle. And other addictions, the ease of access to addictive substances like opioids, these are very difficult to dismantle. So this is where I felt very pessimistic. But what did you think at that point?
Yeah, well, I generally agree. I think as the thesis, as I identify it, he makes the point. He doesn't perhaps, argue it as forcefully as he might have done, that the reason why we have this preoccupation in the West, which is a kind of narcissistic preoccupation with identity and purity and transgression, is because history had ended, and it had ended on Western terms. So the premise upon which identity politics, emerges or takes its current, what Nick Cohen has called zombie left characteristic, is that history ended and the West won. That the whole third way understanding was that war between major states would no longer occur again. And all we need now is to modify the market to make it socially just. So social justice as an agenda comes out of the end of history. Again, Mitchell understands that, but it is the fact that the West seemingly won and history ended that is the basis for this kind of bipolarity that he identifies, and the schizophrenia that embraces Western institutions now, that somehow, because we won so successfully, that because market state democracy so successfully emerged at the end of the Second World War and transformed the West, and entire, and as it was in the 80s and 90s, transforming Asia as well. The West had won. It's made very clear by Fukuyama, and even more clearly by writers like Thomas Friedman, and the agenda totally permeated both left and right politics. So what happens at the end of history then is, as he points out, there must then be a ledger, that the West has done so well, but we didn't do it innocently. We did it quite transgressively. We fought wars, we were colonialists, we were slave owners. Somehow that's more problematic for the West than it is for Russia or China or the Ottoman or Abbasid imperial arrangements, which were equally brutal, violent, and probably more so. It's only because history ended and we won that we've gone through this sort of rather bizarre interrogation and guilt trip about ourselves, that we were successful, we were powerful, we were dynamic, open, and incredibly capable of building worthwhile political societies that had never before been seen on Earth, with very successful commercial Republican arrangements, of which America was the outstanding example. And yet we can't live with that. We have to, as a liberal, well, it seems to me part of the problem is, Michel is a liberal, and liberals are never satisfied, as the great late conservative Anglo-American philosopher Kenneth Minogue said in his work On the Liberal Mind in 1963, the liberal is never satisfied. He's always looking for something to be more interested in. And he is particularly interested in the suffering situation. And that sort of, freedom to interrogate ourselves and to feel guilty about our previous exploits is what informs this transgressive mentality. So identity politics comes out of the end of history. And as he says, also out of this end of history, we've moved from an analog world to a digital world. And the digital world is very dangerous for classic individualism or classic liberalism, and probably for classic conservatism as well. So, and he seems to want a return. Well, he says, the liberal competence world was an analog world, not a digital world. Well, if that's the case, then the analog world is dying. What's occurred since the emergence of big tech, really after 2004 with, the GAFA tetralogy, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, has really reinvented capitalism without capital, as some people have referred to it. Plus, it's made this massive intrusion into the self in a way that Mitchell signals, but the AI revolution goes far beyond just the digitalization of the world and its intrusion into our everything we do via Facebook and Google, via our social media, that it reads and reads us through it. It's the area that he might have addressed. It is what this AI agenda is doing to the self, because he's already pointed out that the self of the Christian was increasingly modified by modern capitalism, and the new, the insecure self of the woke identity politics has always been, has been there since what, the 1960s, really, since the Me Decade. And writers like Christopher Lasch, who are not mentioned by Mitchell, made much of the minimal self and the revolt of the elites in his posthumous work, that has moved away from its attachment to the citizenry of the polity that live in the analog world, not the digital world. And this AI intervention is now moving beyond, writers like Franklin Foer in World Without Mind see Google and Amazon even more bleakly than Mitchell does, in the way that they are actually interested in creating humans that can live forever through the singularity that that they're seeing, whereas Mitchell, in his conclusion, makes the point, the classic Christian or conservative point, really, that actually we all suffer from a virus that will kill us. He calls it Adam 69. You should probably add a few more years on, probably Adam 75 or something. But we are all living with the virus of death. Why are we so obsessed with the COVID thing? Well, because we think we can cure death. And in fact, the ideal behind some of the universities or the centers that Peter Thiel and the Facebook people, Google, are all interested in is, as a writer has called, to be a machine, that we can somehow live forever through AI. This transhumanism is part of a new part of the woke agenda that really undermines any potential for liberal individualism going forward, I think. And the other point, the other point that, you're quite right, it always requires an increasingly big state to control those who are outside the elite through this digital machinery, a sort of a soft despotism, which, as he rightly, points out, de Tocqueville was onto in the 1840s, really.
Yeah. Yeah, that bit actually surprised me. You said a lot of brilliant things there, insightful things, David. You make these statements, and there's so much. Yeah, you stimulate so much, so many ideas in me. I don't know where to start. I mean, I think probably for the audience perspective, we should probably point out how Mitchell places liberalism, because, as you articulated there, he blames the rise of wokeism on the end of history thesis, which is, dated. The end of history is dated to around 1991, so recent term. So identity politics has been with us for decades before that, but it really exploded in the 1990s in Mitchell's theory, because the triumph of the West left liberals with nothing else to complain about apart from themselves, so they turned on themselves. But we should point out that Mitchell identifies as a liberal, and he does, but he is criticizing these end of history type theorists, principally Francis Fukuyama, as neoliberal. So he's differentiating himself as a liberal, principally, I think, as a classical liberal. He's differentiating himself as a classical liberal from the neoliberals, like Francis Fukuyama, who are not true liberals. And he has another argument here about how the Republican Party in America has failed to defend liberalism because it too embraced neoliberalism. So it was a rather like Thatcherism is criticized for the same reason. Like Reaganism, Thatcherism shares an easy caricature as neoliberal, meaning they put the free market ahead of individual freedoms. So and also social stability, social cohesion, and other things that social conservatives care about. So the free market is allowed to intrude into and ruin individual socioeconomic freedoms because the market is deified as something that should decide what is best for us. So individuals don't get to decide what's best for us. So what you were talking about as trends towards the undermining of the individual's autonomy and thence their competence, the word that Joshua Mitchell uses, it's the rise of the digital economy, but also in Mitchell's argument, it's the rise of neoliberalism. That's the wrong sort of liberalism in his view. And he also makes a point about conservatism, which I think he understates, because I think the motivation, he understates conservatism because he's motivated to resurrect classical liberalism, and he understates the capacity of conservatism to restrain the savage impulses of liberalism in its neoliberal form. So conservatives can say to neoliberals, at least, if not liberals in the modern American sense, which is progressivism, conservatives can say, hold on, you don't need to pursue endless justice or endless individual freedoms. Let's think about what institutions we need to conserve. And I don't think Mitchell gives conservatism enough of a role in his solutions. And as I say, I think the motivation for that on his side is that he is so interested in promoting liberalism against the neocons and the neoliberals that took over the Republican Party. He's unwilling to reaccommodate what we might call classical conservatism, which is about conservation of things. Even though Mitchell is interested in conserving things, he's very antagonistic to the hypocrisy of the woke in being very pro-environment at the same time as they're very high consumers, such of things like plastic bottles. That's the example he gives at length. So he's a conservative in the conservationist sense, and I think he could make more use of that conservatism, that form of conservatism, to restore a politics of common sense, away from this endless, simplistic, ideological pursuit of social justice, to the ignorance of its counterproductiveness. So that's one point I wanted to bring in, because he does try to place his political philosophy within these larger political strands when he is criticizing the current manifestation of liberalism. It's not a liberalism as you, I, or he would identify with. It's a bastardized form of liberalism. It's a perverted form of liberalism. It's not about individual freedom. It's about certain privileged groups being privileged under the pretense that we are countering privilege, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's, I suppose what, I think, you know, the idea that he's making a case for liberal competence against the both the woke and the neoliberal end of the Republican Party or Republican, post Reaganite, Thatcherite pursuit of the market at all costs at the expense of the citizen, really, the citizen of the nation state.
It's the pre-Trump Republican Party too, because he
Yes.
talks about Trump as being the necessary corrective.
Sure.
That direction in the Republican Party. So he as so far as he is a Republican, he's more of a Trumpian Republican than he is a Reagan Republican.
Well, I think so, but I think what he's trying to make, the key point about neoliberalism and the idea that unfettered globalization and a borderless world were all understandings of neoliberalism that were absolutely foolhardy and ultimately destructive of the integrity of the nation state. So where he is quite conservative and perhaps kind of version of liberal conservatism is the understanding of that we are citizens of somewhere. We and the elites do not believe that, and that's a point. He does reference Goodhart's work on anywheres and somewheres, although he offers us a sort of a slightly different digital and analog variation, which are,
and also Oakeshott. He cites Oakeshott a lot, and Oakeshott
there's not as much as he could have.
Yeah, that's true.
So in terms of management, society, and selfie man, the problematic self that's emerged under wokeness and under neoliberalism is obviously a version of Oakeshott's understanding of rationalism in politics. And I think what I would have argued, and you're sort of implying as well, is what an Oakeshottian would argue for is not a return to classical liberalism, but a return to politics, a politics of competence rather than a liberal competence, and a politics that assumes that there is another viewpoint, there are extremes, and there is a mean to be achieved. So, and it's interesting to me that there's no reference to the idea of prudence in politics, which is not only a classical liberal understanding, or at least a Lockean one, but it's also a classically conservative one. And his references to classical thought are almost entirely drawn from Plato, and we get very little of Aristotle or Thucydides. And Aristotle in particular, of course, is not averse to the idea that there are rhetorical differences that can be, that people can adopt different positions within a rhetorical frame, and that politics is the art of balancing between extremes, and that is an understanding that then Oakeshott promulgates in particularly on human conduct, but also in his essays on rationalism in politics. So in a sense, I felt that when he's saying that, part of the problem is not only, the identity, the transgressor innocent, the neoliberalism, the management society, the big state, and how do we get back to a more modest politics that he sort of identifies in his conclusion. We've got to move away from globalism, and instead of seeing us in the market is something we go to, and he makes a good argument from Adam Smith about the Wealth of Nations, that Smith was very conscious of the fact that you don't leave it all to the entrepreneurs, the big business, that actually the only people who've got a stake in the nation state that is a commercial state are the landowners, not the entrepreneurs, who are mobile and transnational, as we know from our current elite politics. And I suppose and then he says that, that the trouble with modern politics is that both sides engage in sloganeering. You know, we are this, you are that. There's no room for compromise. And so the art of the political rather than the liberal competence is what has been lost. And I suppose it's the reclamation of the idea of a conversational politics, as Oakeshott or even Isaiah Berlin would see as central to the political condition, as would other writers like Bernard Crick or Hannah Arendt. And that idea of, you know, so he's still interested in a future project for liberalism, a liberalism that is kind of progressive, whereas the political understanding is always to live with present, you know, to value the present, to value what we are as a society, and to try and, you know, understand with Burke that there are things that can be improved, but always in response to a given condition that we've achieved over time that is not negligible. So his conclusion, which is, you know, an interesting one, that we should move away from liberal universalism that has got us, you know, particularly America, into forever wars that have, you know, kind of undermined its basic integrity, really, to a more modest form of political understanding, requires not a return to maybe liberal competence, but to the idea of politics.
Yeah, but yes, he said that beautifully. I think Mitchell, if he was here, he would say that he does recognize the value of pragmatic politics. I actually don't recall that he actually ever uses that word pragmatic, even though pragmatic is a very common word in political scientific analysis of what we're talking about here. You're right, he doesn't refer back to the ancients in describing this pragmatism. In effect, doesn't use the word, but that's what he's talking about. He goes back to pre-revolutionary France, and he makes the very basic point that before the revolution, the French Revolution, there was left and right politics, and the left and right were necessary balances to each other. So the conservatives could restrain the radicalism, and the radicals could kick the conservatives into necessary changes. So there was this nice balance between right and left. And he makes the parallel between the French Revolution and our current wokeism, is that the French Revolution abandoned that balance, and it's all about change. Everything had to be changed, even the calendar. And the woke have that same attitude. Everything needs to be torn down. Everything in the past was wrong. There's nothing to conserve. Yes. And it cycles back to my earlier point that conservatism must be part of the solution here, because conservatism in the conservationist sense is about saying, hang on a moment, what do we need to preserve? Not everything in the past is wrong. There are things that we have settled upon that have value, even when they have flaws. Because we are settled to them, they have social values that we shouldn't hastily destroy with the mission to improve upon them. So sometimes we know we can improve on our institutions, but we don't, because we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I think in his solutions, I find his solutions a bit disappointing. I don't think they're actually well developed. And I think he could make like you're saying, he could make a deeper, a longer historical exploration of the philosophical foundations for the sort of solution we need. His solutions come out to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, they come out to me a bit like, well, we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. He doesn't really, you know, he's also saying, let's rediscover things we did before the woke, and by implication, what we should rediscover is Christianity, which I don't think is a prescription. I don't think that's a viable prescription. We might want to take some things out of Christianity and put them back in our in our Christian culture, but I don't think we're going to get people to become, you know, Christians again. That was one of the implications. You can tell me if I'm wrong to read that into it, but his solutions I did find quite disappointing.
Yeah, I'm not sure about whether he thinks, you know, it's a return to Christianity. I think the strength of his argument about the transgressor innocent dichotomy is that a sort of a post-Christian understanding has been read into the new purificationism of identity politics. What we need to do is to get this kind of quasi-religious, ideological, political religion out of the political, really. So I kind of agree with that. But how you go about that, I'm not so sure, you know, because...
Does he really say that explicitly? Because the way you just said it reminds me of what I've seen elsewhere, and I've actually articulated myself in other writings, which is that we need to get religion out of politics in general. We need secular politics, and that applies as much to woke quasi-religion as it does to religious extremism of all kinds, and that's relevant to this this description of the West's problems, because one of the perversities in woke politics is that generally it's anti-religious, but it privileges certain religions. So part of it being anti-Western is to be anti-Christian, and to a lesser extent anti-Semitic too. So that is truer in British politics. The fact that the radical left that has taken over the British left has had a lot of anti-Semitic scandals in the last decade or two, particularly under Jeremy Corbyn, who is now no longer leader of the Labour Party, but has left a legacy in the Labour Party of anti-Semitism. So certain religions are transgressors in Mitchell's terms, but other religions like Islam are innocent.
That's right.
So Islam is regarded as a victim of other religions, and even the facts of Islamic terrorism, which is something on which I teach, and I'm just saying that because I'm saying I happen to know a lot about Islamic terrorism, but that puts me in a position to say the woke are in the ridiculous position of denying Islamic terrorism. So Islamic terrorism is not really Islamic, or it's merely a reaction to the West's persecution, and that, you know, that's nonsense. I don't have time to go into it, but there are lots of internal reasons to Islam why Islam is correlated with terrorism. And I say that, by the way, without denying that Muslims are the biggest victims of Islamic terrorism. Islamic terrorism is like gun crime in America. Its main victims are its perpetrators, but in terms of identity politics. But just use that as an example of the ridiculous situation the woke can get into, where they pretend to be advancing equity, but always they are privileging one identity over another, because equity is an impossible objective to achieve. It's not pragmatic. Equity is not pragmatic. Equality of opportunity is practical. It is pragmatic. Equity of outcome is not. It's ridiculous. You can only achieve it in very authoritarian ends, and you can only achieve it by you achieve it mainly by bringing people down rather than raising people up, and you raise people up mostly by bringing other people down. So it's certainly not liberal, and it's not even practical. And I think I'm saying all that to bring in something which I don't think Mitchell articulates, is that one of the solutions to our current politics is possibly to insist on a sort of secularism. We don't want these these ideologies in our politics. So the Western liberal democratic tradition is, one of its core principles is a separation of church and state. If Mitchell is correct that the woke politics is actually in effect a religion, we need to separate this religion from our politics. People can have religion in the privacy of their home. They should not impose religious ideologies on our political systems. Now, that in certain senses, that's not a particularly practical prescription either, but nonetheless, we have to go there from the theory Mitchell has given us. Mitchell has said wokeism has partly come out of a perversion of Christianity. And thus, the solution to that has to be a classical liberal solution to previous eras where religion dominated politics to the detriment of individual freedoms and majority rule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think for me and for you, obviously, we agree that this religious perversion operating under the sign of identity politics is something that is inimical to a political condition. How you go about reasserting the political against the ideological and really the potential totalitarianism of this woke identity that is tearing us apart is difficult to negotiate. And what Mitchell leaves us with as a response, which is, well, we've got to move away to the market as use value rather than an ideology of the market. We have to do something about the wound of slavery, which, well, okay. And then we've got to move away from liberal universalism to something more modest. Well, yeah, absolutely. Beyond that, we're not offered much in the way of, how we're going to respond. And I suppose the other area that he makes much of is that, I think where he would see that we have to adjust, our standards to criticisms of where the West has, gone wrong, is he uses this analogy between the supplement and the substitution, or substitutionism. And so we understand that we do want to promote justice, but we have to temper it with mercy, he argues. So, we have, in education something that's valuable, but we don't want to replace it by the digitalized classroom as a substitute for the face-to-face relationship between teacher and student, for instance. So he does a number of case studies, if you like, of how the supplement can add value to the product, whether it's justice, education, the environment. But when it becomes the supplement becomes a substitute for the real or the previous experience, it replaces it with something which leads us into this kind of digitalized condition of what is essentially complete anomie, where we need the big state to, look after our every need, really. So what is identified as our problem is very well articulated and very well done. How we respond, it wasn't so well articulate. Well, it wasn't really well. You know, I can't see a program there. You know, very much.
It was underspecified. I think.
Yeah, understand. Well, that's a very good word for it. Yes.
Yeah. So I think
to his credit, you know, I don't know that anybody's got a very clear solution. But as you say, I think we both agree that we have to, you know, kind of reassert the idea of the political and the idea of, you know, that we are a secular condition that, you know, wants tolerance, but certainly doesn't want to tolerate the intolerant, which is what we're forced to do through wokeness.
And to be fair to Mitchell, he articulates most strongly something that I think you and I both agree with, which is the reassertion of classical liberalism. So he makes that point early on. I don't think he specifies what that means, what classical liberalism means, or how we would practically put that back into our politics. But it's very clear, there's no doubt that he is saying, let's get back classical liberalism. Let's get back the politics of individual competence, which involves, as he articulates a few times, rolling back the state, getting the state out of individual welfare.
Where people can cooperate with each other.
Yeah, that's true. We haven't talked about that. Is that one of the perversities of our current politics is that individuals, by becoming more dependent on the state, they feel powerless, and then they are less likely to socialize, or less likely to socialize in a communitarian sense. So his theory has an implication for communities which we haven't articulated yet, which is that communities must inevitably decline when you take away individual autonomy and when you undermine individual competence, because the individual then feels less powerful to make communities, to help communities, to participate in communities. And as he memorably says a few times, the way we see that is that people retreat into their private homes and play video games and mess around on social media all day as substitutes for real social interaction, real community building. I think he articulates that very well. So we should be fair and say Mitchell, so far as Mitchell has strong prescriptions, they tend to be very high level and abstract, but they are very strong and clearly justified in terms of restoring classical liberalism, the competence of the individual, individual autonomy, and the individual's powerfulness to go out and make communities as we once expected good Americans to do.
And also, you know, the idea of, you know, one of the strong points he makes is that competition, you know, the antonym of competition is not cooperation. You know, you can be cooperatively competitive in real communities, and you know, by people cooperating and, you know, forming new projects that they might take to market or not, people have real relationships rather than abstract ones. And the part of the problem of the big state, the replacement of substitutes instead of supplements in areas like social media has meant, well, we've become more anomic, but also at the same time, we're supposed to identify with an abstract community, you know, whether we're Black or female or transgender or whatever. Abstract communities replace real communities in this perverse etiology.
Yeah, we should just explain this theory of supplements versus substitutes, because we've already got to the conclusions and the prescriptions. Just to be clear to the audience, Mitchell is talking about 3 afflictions that curse America, but as we said earlier, what he's saying actually applies to the West in general. So the first one was identity politics, and then it's what he calls bipolarity, and then third, addictions, and it's the addictions where where supplements become substitutes for things. So we should talk about the bipolarity and addiction briefly, and I'll just make a material note about why it's easy to read this book as a book just about identity politics. It's because the first 132 pages are that's all about identity politics. He calls it part one. It's all about identity politics. And then he gets to bipolarity and affliction, sorry, bipolarity and addiction as the second and third afflictions. And those make up only about 50 pages. So 136 pages on identity politics, and then 50 pages on addiction and bipolarity. So I think that's sort of a structural problem to the book, is that the book itself doesn't give enough attention to the second and third afflictions that they really deserve, and that's caused us to sort of skip over them because we've been talking about identity politics so much, but we should give them their due. I'll let you, David, talk about the addiction bit, his theory about the addiction, because you've mentioned several times how that manifests, how our addictiveness, by our, I mean our current generational Western societal afflictions of being addicted to things like social media, video games, dependency on the state, as Mitchell describes it. These addictions, they cause people to take supplements to a good life and turn them into substitutes for real living. So a good example of that is he blames obesity, the Western curse of obesity, on people using food as a substitute for other things. So eating well used to be a supplement to living well. Now it's a substitute to living well. So people are just using food as their one and only comfort. That's Mitchell's theory.
Yeah, sorry.
What did you think about the addiction part?
Well, I thought, yeah, he could have expanded this. I thought it was very interesting, and as you say, we've got a lot of identity politics at the first, kind of, well, almost half the book, or over half the book.
Over
really.
half the book, yeah.
And then the bipolarity of the identity politics feeding into the big state, techno management of our everyday lives, and giving us or making us addicted in a way that undermines our own self-worth, really, in a sense that we're all dependent on social media buzzes, that Facebook deliberately tries to create, through, sort of things that signify that we're liked rather than disliked. It means we're completely dependent on not real friends, but Facebook friends, which, classically undermines any sense of a kind of self-worth outside the kind of computer reality we live in. And, on the computers, we become etiolated and, fat, chewing on Mars bars or whatever. I've got my brother-in-law who teaches has just gone back to a local school, now that they've come back from 3 months of lockdown, and he's noticed how pale and fat, his 4th and 5th year students are. They haven't been out, they haven't been exercising, they've been stuck in front of video games or computers, chewing away on fast foods, which, Mitchell makes the point of, was okay, they could be a supplement to a real, proper meal, in an environment where you're, in a competitive market arrangement. But now fast foods have replaced real food. So the supplement has become a substitute. And the same is true of, friendship being replaced by virtual friendship. And the other one, of course, is, and he goes, the classic example, when the nice illustration from the Republic, where Plato talks about, the needs for medicine. Medicine's a supplement to the good life, and really it's about diet and keeping yourself healthy, and you might take some medicines or some dietary provisions from the the Asclepian or Hippocratic. Well, he doesn't mention Hippocrates, but he was a contemporary of Plato's, writing about how you dieted and conducted yourself, which was not just about diet, but about exercise, about maintaining your mental as well as your physical condition, and knowing that you shouldn't, substitute, the medical for a lived life. So preserving people from death was something, absolutely anathematical to Greco-Roman medicine. And at some point, if you are decaying, it wasn't the job of medicine to intervene, to say that, well, we can keep you alive a bit longer. And part of our current condition has been a kind of, well, a medical nemesis that we've seen with COVID, which Mitchell, does refer to, because, again, it's about the idea that we cannot possibly die. And the idea that we are now in a sort of iatrogenic condition where the medical gaze becomes almost totalitarian, as we know from the NHS despotism we live with in the UK, that no government can reverse the edicts of Sage. So a group of unelected medical practitioners whose science is somewhat questionable at the best of times assert themselves as a new soft despotism in de Tocqueville's sense. We're being looked after, but how? When we can't work, stuck in front of televisions, not meeting people in this socially distanced environment that leads us to utter misery under the sign of health, is something that was, very clearly there with Plato, and especially his analogy, when he talks about the nature of democratic man towards the end of the Republic.
Yeah, so well said, David. I think we should get on to bipolarity. We have not yet, I don't think we have referred to this part of his book. So this is the second affliction, bipolarity. Yeah, I think it relates to the addiction problem. What he means by bipolarity is what other political scientists have talked about as political moods. And Mitchell starts this part by talking about oscillations, so that there is a political theoretic tradition of seeing electorates or the body politic as oscillating between one party or the other. So that makes sense in sort of psychological overcompensatory terms, that we're always overcompensating for the last political party that was in power. So it was too left wing, so we overcompensate and go right, and then we go too right wing, and then we overcompensate, go the other way. So we're constantly oscillating, and we never hit the sweet spot, or if we do hit the sweet spot, it's short, because then we're trending too far towards overcompensation. So he starts this section on bipolarity by talking about oscillations, which is kind of conventional in one strand, the sort of strand of political theory that you and I talk about. However, I should point out it is not accepted in woke politics, because woke politics is linear, meaning there is there is equity to head for, and we don't oscillate. We don't accept that history has cycles. This is the woke point of view. History is linear. There are the repressed and the powerful, and the job of the woke is to undermine the powerful and redistribute it, and then we reach utopia, and that's the end of history. And it's just linear. So that's one of the reasons why our students no longer learn cyclical theories of politics, oscillatory theories of politics, or the psychology behind oscillations in politics. So I just put that out there for the audience to know. There's a whole body of literature going back to the ancients, and Mitchell cites some of those ancient sources on the theories of how politics oscillate, but you won't read any of that in universities, because universities have gone woke and they don't accept that history has any oscillations in it. It's just a linear path through everything bad until woke utopia. But you and I, because we're of a certain age and of a more scholarly bent, we have read this stuff about oscillatory politics. What is new in Mitchell is that he imports, or I should say cross-fertilizes, he cross-fertilizes from the psychology of bipolarity, which I haven't seen done before. So bipolarity being a manic depressive, also known as a manic depressive disorder, that a psychology isn't just about overcompensations, it's these dysfunctional extremes of manic depression, or a mania for creativity, and he's arguing that our culture, our Western culture, is more bipolar in both the psychological and the metaphorical senses. So that, as in, it's a psychological affliction. Westerners are becoming more bipolar in the psychological sense. They are suffering a psychological illness. They're becoming more bipolar in their taste for foods as well as for politics, which I don't think is an argument I've seen before. Have you seen it before?
Well, sort of elements are there with, as I said, Christopher Lasch was onto this in the idea of the culture of narcissism and the minimal self to an extent. Although I think, Mitchell brings out the as you say, we are in a psychically troubled time, and the bipolarity analogy is a good one, I think, because he uses that phrase from de Tocqueville that democratic citizens, Tocqueville wrote, would someday believe that they are either greater than kings or less than men. This that sort of idea that we can, if we're not fulfilled, if our desires are not immediately gratified, then we plunge into depressive states without the capacity for balance. That was a very classical understanding, and what Plato always saw as the problem of democracy was that people were always endlessly in pursuit of new stimulants, and when they didn't satisfy, they'd move on to the next thing. And I suppose one of the aspects of wokeness that, as he rightly asserts, is it sort of it gives you a righteousness that makes you feel good, even though the righteousness is completely facile and not so much. Not only is it not real, it's almost surreal. So that if we have become so bipolarized, unfortunately, as he says, with leading on from that into the problem of the substitution, or the substitute instead of the supplement, becoming all important and addictive, that there's little hope here for a return to, the mens sana in corpore sano idea that was central to the classical world and was central to, education in the 19th century.
Yeah, we should explain that the bipolarity bit of Mitchell's argument has an overlap with the digitization of society that you were talking about earlier. He uses a sort of metaphorical term for the current manifestation of bipolarity. He calls it management society and selfie man. And he means this in a bipolar or contradictory sense. So the management society and the selfie man, they're sort of opposites, and they're poles on an extreme, and they're somewhat incompatible, and their contradictoriness is contributing to the negativity of the affliction. So this is not a balance. They're two negative extremes. They don't balance each other. They're not two forms.
Well, in a sense, I think the analogy is a nice one: management society and selfie man, or selfie person, maybe.
But he's not particularly correct about that.
No, not correct there. So the selfiness, that's. Lash would see that as the narcissism of the minimal self, Yeah. But in a sense, the managerial society, the bureaucracy, the technocracy, wants selfie man because it can feed it its necessarily stimulating, kind of technology that makes selfie man or selfie person, happy or temporarily stimulated,
That's true. They sort of enable each other. They sort of enable each other. So the state enables people to become very self-oriented because the state says, we will provide for you. You don't need to look after yourself. You don't need to make your own decisions. We're going to make your decision. We're going to decide what's best for you. So that allows people to retreat into their self. So they're enabled by the state. And then the state is enabled by the selfie man, because the selfie man says, it's all about me. What are you going to do for me? So the state, the selfie man is going to vote for a state that says, well, we're going to take care of you. So they sort of enable each other, but it's not a virtuous enablement.
But it becomes that sort of soft despotism that that de Tocqueville kind of noticed in democracy in America. But the other irony of it is its condition of civility, really. So we are slaves of the state and the selfiness of the digital media, and yet the very people who have returned to a state of happy slavery are the ones most animated about the condition of slavery that apparently started America.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there's an explanation Mitchell has for that, which he doesn't make explicit, but there's a fantastic quote on page 146 where he's summarizing the problem of bipolarity, this mutual enablement from state to selfie man. He says citizens look upward to global managers, meaning they look up to the elite to provide for them and tell them what to do. Then continuing the quote, they look inward to their selfie selves. This has spared them from looking outward to fellow citizens, many of whom they judge to be irredeemably stained, but with whom they might have nevertheless built a world of liberal competence together. So I think that really ties together a lot of the themes you and I have been talking about, is that this new politics is making individuals dependent on the state and incompetent to run their own lives. It's making an elite all powerful and less accountable, and it's destroying communities because individuals don't have the power or the competence to go out and build things. And thence, by implication, this is the part where he's not explicit, what sort of politics are these sorts of people left with? It's destructive. Let's destroy communities. Let's change everything, and let's do it in a ultimately selfish way, while we pretend to be pretend to care about making everybody equal.
Yeah, I think that's and also the further point that is implicit in that section, or that paragraph 72 that you're quoting from, is that the whole idea of citizenship, which is so central to, the value of place and community within a political structure we call the state or the nation state, citizenship has been eroded. And instead, anybody can be, well, instead of being a citizen of a place and a country, you are now, in the elite sense, a citizen of the world that doesn't need a border, but only needs access to the state institutions, which now must follow not the state, but some liberal universalist social justice agenda, which makes no difference between an illegal immigrant and a real citizen, which is part of the reason why there are big issues in Georgia now about who can vote, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, David, you and I have talked a lot about this book, and I think that's credit to the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
American Awakening. And that you and I have been able to discuss some very stimulating books that the sorts of books that I think about when I'm away from my work, and they help me make sense of what's going on. So this has been a very valuable book to me. It's been more valuable, actually, being able to talk to you about it. So thank you for that. Yeah, interesting book. Any final thoughts?
No, I think it's an important contribution, and one that needs to be talked about more widely. And I thought just to finish off, that the other point he makes is that he tried, obviously to various university presses were offered the work, but all found it unsuitable to its lists. So again, credit to Encounter Books that are prepared to deal with unfashionable thoughts.
Yeah. David, a real pleasure to talk to you again. Thank you, sir.